Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. After being out of the international news for a while, this past week has been full of new developments in Venezuela. First, the government of President Nicolas Maduro announced on Monday that it reached an agreement with 3 moderate opposition parties. The agreement covered 6 areas and includes a rejection of U.S. economic sanctions, an effort to reactivate the National Assembly, and the confirmation of a new National Electoral Council. The more radical opposition faction that is being supported by the Trump administration and is led by Juan Guaido rejected the agreement and instead issued a statement saying that talks with the Maduro government are exhausted and that Guaido and his followers will enter into a new stage of their struggle. Meanwhile, the Maduro government released photos of Guaido posing with Colombian paramilitary leaders of the group known as Los Rastrojos. Finally, the U.S. government issued new sanctions meant to target Venezuela's subsidized food program known as the CLUPs, or Local Councils for Supply and Production. Joining me now from Caracas, Venezuela, to discuss all of these recent developments is Ricardo Vaz. He's a writer and editor at the website venezuelaanalysis.com. Thanks for joining us today, Ricardo.
Thanks for having me.
I should also note before I start that I'm a co-founder of the site Venezuela Analysis 16 years ago and still serve on its board of directors. So Ricardo, let's start with the negotiations. Which parties signed the agreement with the government, and what does this agreement contain specifically that you consider significant?
Yeah, so as you said, this was very unexpected. The parties that signed are minority opposition parties, like Progressive Advance, which was founded by Henry Falcon, who was notably the opposition candidate in the 2018 presidential election. There are also a handful of other small opposition parties, which they have in recent months kind of distanced themselves from Guaido, especially on the issue of sanctions, which, as you mentioned, is one of the main points of the agreement, like an unequivocal rejection of sanctions, which is very logical. Sanctions are causing widespread suffering in the population. And so even these sectors of the opposition, which are not in any way ideologically close to the government, agree that the sanctions are not helping solve the political crisis any one way or another. So that was one of the main points, and one that clearly sets them apart from what we could call the mainstream opposition, which is being led by Juan Guaido. Other points are, as you also mentioned, the confirmation of a new electoral council. This had been a demand by the opposition for a long time, and it could signal that there are elections coming in the near horizon. The government has threatened time and again that there will be new legislative elections because the current term of the National Assembly is due to expire in December 2020, and elections can be held according to the Constitution any time during the year. So the government has kind of threatened that they will take place as early as January, and as we know, recent elections have always caused splits in the opposition because there are always these sectors that refuse to recognize any authority, and then they boycott the election, and that usually results in an advantage for the government. So those are some of the main points, and another, as you said, is the reincorporation of the pro-government bloc in the National Assembly. So just to make a quick recap of history, the National Assembly has been in contempt of court since 2016. There was a dispute surrounding some legislators accused of electoral fraud that led to an escalating dispute with the Supreme Court, which eventually declared the Assembly in contempt. And after that, its decisions were classified as null and void, and the pro-government deputies left the Assembly. And so now the agreement was to reactivate the National Assembly, although there's no signal on whether this decision by the judicial authorities to declare it in contempt is going to be lifted anytime soon. And also there was a session on Tuesday, and the pro-government bloc did not show up. So it's still not clear how that's going to work out.
Now, what do you think this agreement means? I mean, does it signify a serious rift within the opposition? And if so, how serious is that rift, and how do you see it playing out in the future? Does it basically mean that the Guaido faction might be marginalized, or what exactly do you think it means?
I don't think it represents a big split, because this is a minority faction, or different factions that, for example, have very little weight in the National Assembly, although they have some figures that have relative credibility, like Henry Falcon and Claudio Fermin, who have, as I said, been vocal in their opposition to sanction. I don't think that's going to generate a split. I think this is more a matter of both the government and, let's say, the Guaido-led opposition trying to strengthen their positions, because going back a few months, there were these negotiations brokered by Norway, first in Oslo, then in Barbados, that were apparently progressing. And then in early August, there was this decision by the Trump White House to escalate sanctions into an embargo. And that led the Maduro government to walk away from the negotiating table, which is a reasonable decision. You know, in the end, who are you negotiating with? And so then, ever since, on one hand, the Maduro government went back to this debate whether elections are going to be held soon or not. The opposition shifted its discourse towards this TR, mutual defense, or also known as the Rio Treaty. And now the government again kind of tried to reinforce its position by kind of gathering these we can call them moderate sectors of the opposition that agree on these basic points of rejection of sanctions and trying to normalize, in a way, political life in the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, while the Maduro government is trying to work with this small, moderate opposition faction, it is also highlighting just how far right Guaido and his allies are by releasing those images with the paramilitary leaders. Now, would you say that strategy is working? I mean, just how much support does Guaido still have in Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, these pictures were a huge embarrassment, and just the latest of a series of embarrassment that's derived from this humanitarian aid circus of February. I mean, if we recall, on one hand, there was this Richard Branson Live Aid concert that was going to generate, I don't know, $100 million. In the end, it generated 2 or 3, and we never heard from it again. Then we heard that we found out through a newspaper investigation that some of the money which had been destined for these soldiers that had deserted were actually embezzled by Guaido envoys in Colombia who were living the high life using these funds. And now these revelations that not only did Guaido pose for pictures with these armed paramilitary leaders, which are very unsavory characters, involved in drug trafficking, in targeted killings. There are even reports that they were running a chop house in Colombia. So not only was he posing for pictures with them, but according to reports in Colombian media, they were the ones actually responsible for smuggling Guaido across the border ahead of this February 23rd humanitarian aid, quote-unquote humanitarian aid efforts. As for Guaido's support, it has clearly been dwindling and perhaps more quickly in recent months. And that's a natural consequence of the kind of immediate promises that the government would be ousted. Guaido was on the record just a few weeks ago saying that this would be over in 2019, but just a couple of days ago on Tuesday, the National Assembly actually ratified that he would remain as National Assembly president in 2020, and as interim president and whatever title they assigned to him. So that's clearly a sign that they have shifted their sights into a more long-term strategy, or medium-term, if you want. But yeah, he has been losing support. You can see it in the pictures of his rallies. And what that means is that his support dwindles back to this hardcore opposition, which is very, very radical, very right-wing, and very much in favor of a U.S. intervention. And perhaps that's why we see these discussions surrounding TR, this military treaty being back on the table.
Now, the Trump administration continues to try to pressure the Venezuelan economy, as I mentioned in the beginning. It just passed the new sanctions against the CLAP program, that is the food distribution program. What is the economic situation like nowadays in Venezuela? How are you experiencing it there?
Yeah, I mean, just to give a quick background, this is not the first time that the Trump administration has gone after the CLAP program. There were sanctions a few weeks ago. And the issue is that because of financial sanctions, it's very hard for the Venezuelan government to import food, and so it resorts to this kind of intricate network with different companies abroad through which payments and imports are channeled, and of course that creates huge avenues for corruption, which is what the Treasury Department is saying. But at the same time, what this does in practice is to make Venezuelan ability to import food much more complicated, right? And you can see it on the ground. The clap distribution program, which is in a way the basic subsistence for a very large majority of Venezuelan households, has been affected. Deliveries are now not as frequent as they used to be, and the boxes or the bags do not contain as much food as they used to. So the sanctions are clearly having an impact on the ground.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for now, but hopefully we'll get back to you soon again. I was speaking to Ricardo Vaz, writer and editor with VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Thanks so much, Ricardo, for having joined us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.